Have you read Mark Knowles' The Civil War as a theological crisis? Someone says, I can't help but see a similar crisis happening now. What's your take?
Yes, I have read that book. It's a very good book, fantastic book. And so, yes to that. I think that our situation is worse than it was prior to the war between the states and more muddled because it's less geographically defined. And the United States before the war between the states, let me back up. One time, J. Gresham Machen was talking with B.B. Warfield, and he was worrying about the Presbyterian church splitting. And B.B. Warfield said he didn't need to worry about it because you can't split rotten wood. Right. The United States before the war between the states was tamarack. It was dried tamarack, and people on both sides believed stuff. Right? They had hard convictions, not soft convictions. It wasn't postmodern in any sense of the word. So it was possible to have an old-fashioned clash, an old-fashioned war with people who really cared about territory, honor, victory, the Union, state sovereignty, etc. We are in a fin de siècle, sort of end of the century meltdown, where relativism has rotted out our soul, making everything much harder, much less defined. That's one thing. And the other is, although there are some geographic elements to this, red state, blue state, heartland and the left and the coasts basically, and Illinois. You've got some geographical elements. Still, there's a lot more mix all the way through. A lot of blue centers, it's basically urban versus rural. And that means it's not like the Mason-Dixon line where you've got the border states along the line and then the north and then the south. This is more jumbled. That said, the things that are driving us apart are far more momentous, I think, than the issues that were at stake in the Civil War. And that's because in the Civil War, if you said it's a matter of territorial expansion, it was a matter of civics. The classic scholar Basil Gildersleeve said the war was fought over a point of grammar. Shall we say the United States is, or shall we say the United States are? And I think that that's fair. If you said that it was about slavery, then the issue of slavery would have been, is it right and proper or appropriate for human beings to have their labor monopolized or held permanently by another human being? But there wasn't any debate over whether the slaves were human beings. Right? It had to do with labor. In our abortion debate, we are divided on whether human beings are human beings, right? So, and not just, and if they're not human beings, we can enslave them, but if they're not human beings, we can chop them up into constitutional pieces and sell the parts and have our tax money fund Planned Parenthood that is doing this. And so we don't know what marriage is, we don't know what a boy is, we don't know what a girl is, we don't know what a human being is. So we are far worse off than they were prior to the war between the states. And you throw in the jumbled geographic problems, I think it's going to be far messier when it comes to the inevitable shakedown, which I think is coming. Because, to quote Abraham Lincoln on this, a house divided cannot stand. And we are emphatically divided on those questions. What is marriage? What is sex? What is a human?
And the introduction to that was the reference to Mark Knowles' book, and the person who who wrote this question, seemed to see a similarity to his thesis to what's going on now. Is there a particular point in that book that is a takeaway that you'd apply now?
Well, I read it some years ago. My takeaway, which I don't think is what he's aiming at, was Mark Knoll points out that the Southern defenses of slavery, based on Scripture, where you have all the in Ephesians and in Colossians and 1 Timothy 6 and all these places where they're talking about slavery, Knoll points out, I think very aptly, that those arguments fell flat when you recognize that American slavery was chattel slavery that was racially based. Mm-hmm. Okay, and well, what difference does that make? Well, suppose some white sharecropper in the South got into financial trouble, and he said, "I'm going to fix all this. I'm going to sell myself into slavery." Okay, well, he couldn't. Right? He couldn't, and he couldn't because he was white.
Right. Okay.
Right, and they wouldn't let him. Uh-huh. And why can't I be a slave? Why can't I serve the guy up the hill? Well, you're white. And he would say, but you just finished defending slavery out of the Bible, and all of those slaves in Colossae, in Ephesus, and they were all white.
Right, okay.
What's your deal? You know, what's wrong with you? Mark Knoll points out that was a very that was a glaring incongruity in the Southern defense of slavery that tried to be scripturally based. Okay. The Southerners had a point, up to a point, but then something else got the racial element got inserted, and that was the big takeaway point for me with Mark Knoll. The other thing was it's coming back to me now. The other thing was in Mark Knoll's book, both sides were ostensibly, formally, and more than nominally Christian. And the North had more Unitarians in it, and the South was more Orthodox. But it was still, in the general population, it was still very conservative, evangelical, and the theological crisis was both sides praying to the same God, praying for victory, and here is this momentous political turmoil, and we're all crying out to God, and God did not answer, right? And in some respects, He didn't answer didn't answer anyone's prayers, and so that paved the way to sort of a formal agnosticism when it came to public affairs after the war. But I think we've been steeped in that for so long that I think we're starting to react against it. We're starting to say, well, you have to have some sort of standard to appeal to if you're going to be engaged at all.